Thank you. Good morning to you all, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. So I'll go straight to the point. In this paper, I argue that travel writing was a form of self-imposed exile, originating in his early childhood, when he was exiled from Crete and sent to Naxos, temporarily, to be rescued from the Turks. As a theoretical frame for my argument, I will draw on Edward Said's notion of exile and imply that it can be used in Kazantzakis' case. In turn, I claim that the Cretan had resorted to travel writing in an effort to be engaged in committed writing, which I interpret as a form of intellectual activism. These would nurture an age-old, subconsciously imposed need for action, originating in his childhood years, and that would compensate for his inability to act, as opposed to his inclination towards intellectual and spiritual exercise. I chose to focus on his travels to the Soviet Union and Spain due to the huge socio-political historical changes taking place at the time of his stay, as well as the fact that Russia had been a huge chapter in Kazantzakis' life and ideological journey, while his Taxidebondas Hispania determined his popularity as a travel writer. So, travel writing as exile. By sending him to Naxos, Kazantzakis' father exiled his son on both a physical and metaphorical level, since by differentiating him from the rest of the young Cretans who were raised and in effect destined to be warriors, he was seen as another, different. In Anaphora στον Greco, the father expresses bluntly his disappointment about the fact that his son wasn't meant to be a warrior, but an intellectual. The father's decision to send his son to Naxos with the excuse of protecting him from the Turks implies his conviction that young Nikos would not be able to defend himself in case of attack. Moreover, it implies a fate totally different from Cretans of the same age. Battle with words and ideas in favor of intellectual freedom, as opposed to fighting against the Turks in favor of Crete's freedom. This differentiation, in my opinion, automatically placed young Kazantzakis in the position of the exiled one, the other, which is both a physical and an emotional space distant from the reality lived by other Cretans at the time. Based on Said's reflection on the notion of exile, the position of exile is, I perceive, an internal and external space, as well as a point of view that remained with Kazantzakis throughout his travels. This can be seen in his corresponding lit, and it is what enabled him to walk in and out of cultures, countries, and ideologies whenever his heart dictated the need to flee. Also, I would like to suggest that travel writing nurtured the first part of the dyadic cosmopolitanism versus patriotism, a political frame within which Kazantzakis placed himself in general, which is a huge chapter in itself, so I won't go into depth. Within this thought frame, cosmopolitanism is viewed as the ideal of becoming a citizen of the world, seen as a kind of exile from the nestling feeling of attachment to one's country or nation. I refer to Nussbaum patriotism or cosmopolitanism. Assuming the position of the xenos, the visitor, but at the same time the citizen of the world, he could engage himself in a narrative that seemingly flirted with novelistic as well as political discourse, thus creating for himself a space for interventions, sometimes direct and at other times camouflaged in a political intellectual sphere. In other words, in this space he had created for himself, he could be an intellectual activist, since he could not become an actual one. In this way, travel writing compensated for his inability to get physically engaged in the evils of his own times. Trying to substantiate my almost instinctive perception of Kazantzakis' turn to travel writing as an attempt to create a comforting space for his status as an exile, I came across Said's notion of exile. with reference to his 1999 memoir Out of Place, as well as his reflections on exile and other essays. As Babo claims, the theme of exile is central in Said's critical and scholarly works. I came to find that a close study on Said's and Kazantzakis' life can lead to the conclusion that they were very similar as regards the experience of estrangement and exile, which unavoidably shaped their thought. First, Said was born in Palestine, and due to the unstable situation there, he had to leave, just like the threat of the Turks in Crete was the major reason why Kazantzakis' family left Crete for a while. Second, Said had moved away from his birthplace 3 times, having as his final destination the US, where he lived and died, while Kazantzakis lived almost all over the world, died in Germany, and thereafter was permanently laid to rest in Crete. Third, just like Kazantzakis was enrolled in a Catholic school in Naxos while his family went back to Crete, Said too was placed in a boarding school at a very young age, where he felt as the xenos in all aspects. Fourth, like Kazantzakis, who turned to books and imaginings, trying to view his stay in Naxos as a first step to his intellectual freedom, in order to deal with the pain of being cut off from his family. On a similar note, Said discerns how both geographical ruptures and familial estrangements propelled him to search for a freely chosen identity. And finally, in both cases, countries other than their homelands were the ones that offered creative refuge for them to both be and become. Hence, all the above factors enabled Said to form his theory of exile. It refers to the idea of a sacred space created in language that alludes to Kazantzakis' idea of ieri paraphrosini, while he claims that travel narrative is central to the exile's identity, which is a noteworthy correlation for obvious reasons. Moreover, Said often used exile as a metaphor to describe his vision of the role of the modern intellectual who needs a critical, detached perspective from which to examine her surroundings. This reminds us of Kazantzakis' convictions of how the intellectual should approach current reality and transfer it to the masses. As Said points out, quote, being attuned to more than one culture can give the exile contrapuntal awareness of simultaneous dimensions of reality, because an exile's life is nomadic, decentered, and lived on the periphery of the established order. He must create his own structures of meaning. End of quote. It seems to me that the experience of exile itself, the childhood memory of the initial displacement as an involuntary travel, that Said's describing his work, claiming that these formed an exilic worldview and an account of how one thought ought to live in response to the condition of exile, can enlighten our analysis of Kazantzakis' travel literature. Traveling as a form of intellectual activism. In the introductory note to Ταξιδεύοντας Ρωσία, Kazantzakis writes, «Λέω την αλήθεια όπως την είδα τα μάτια μου. Η στιγμή που περνούμε είναι τόσο κρίσιμη που κάθε ψευτιά ή αποσιώπηση της αλήθειας θα ήταν πράξη ατιμωτική». At the same time, in his introduction to the part dedicated to the Spanish Civil War in Ταξιδεύοντας Ισπανία, he states something very similar. Τώρα που επιχειρώ να γράψω, νιώθω όλη την ευθύνη της μαρτυρίας μου. Θα πω ότι είδα τίμια, καθαρά, χωρίς καμιά μεροληψία. In these instances, the Cretan clearly states his intention to be impartial in recording his experience from traveling in the Soviet Union and Spain during the socio-political turmoil that characterized the corresponding period of his travels. Impartiality and the task of truthfully enlightening the readers through the written records about the existing situation in each country, the conflicts, the opposing parties, etc., are, one could argue, characteristics of committed writing. Flirting with journalistic discourse. This, in my opinion, is related to the Cretan writer's effort to become involved in the events that mark that period, 1925 to 27, and react against the evils of his own times, engaging thus in intellectual activism. The Cretan believed in responsibility on both a personal and universal level, for everything was, according to him, an ongoing interplay. In ασκητική, hence, he urges the reader accordingly να αγαπάς την ευθύνη, να λες εγώ μονάχος μου έχω χρέος να σώσω τη γης, αν δεν σωθεί εγώ φταίω. At the same time, he points out that each person leads a different type of struggle, depending on where his or her strength lies, and that everyone should be appreciated for their contribution. Να αγαπάς τον καθένα ανάλογα με τη συνεισφορά του στον αγώνα. One cannot help but wonder whether in this instance, Kazantzakis attempts to justify his intellectual struggle, which reminds us of his father's words when he enrolled his son at the Catholic school in Naxos. Κρίμα μεγάλο που δεν είσαι εσύ για τα άρματα. Είσαι για τα γράμματα. Τι να κάνουμε. Αυτός είναι ο δρόμος σου. In the same work, he confesses that a reader's fate is heavy and graceless, for he has no other option than to use words, which he interprets as the entrapment of his inner force in stillness. On a similar note, in his introduction to Ταξιδεύοντας Ιταλία, Αίγυπτος, Σινάη, Ιερουσαλήμ, Κύπρος, Ομοριάς, Kazantzakis expresses his frustration for having to express his agony and internal fight through writing. Κι άξαφνα για πρώτη φορά στη ζωή μου αηδία ανέβηκε στο σπλάχνο μου, αγανάκτηση για τα χαρτιά τούτα, τα βιβλία και τα μελάνια όπου χάνομουν, για τον αγώνα μου τον ανώσιο, να κλείσω μέσα σε καλούπια ωραιότητα στην ψυχή μου. And we've got an inner monologue. Άλλος γίνεται ήρωας από Θεού, άλλος με τον ειδικό του αγώνα. Μάχουμε. Ήρωας. Μα ήρωας θα πει πειθαρχία σε ανώτερο από το άτομο ρυθμό. Και εσύ είσαι ακόμα όλος ανησυχία και ρεμπεγιό. Θα με ακούς πάντα σε κάθε σου φυγή. Ποτέ δεν έφυγα. Πάντα προχωρώ, παρατώντας ότι αγάπησα, ξεσκίζοντας την καρδιά μου. Ως πότε. Δεν ξέρω. Through an inner monologue, the writer expresses his inner battle between the desire for action and the almost unavoidable channeling of this desire into intellect and writing. Seen in relation to the general context of this work, it is as if he admits to his feeling of disgrace when realizing the absence of any other means available to take a stand in the socio-political context of each destination. Finally, in this inner monologue, there seems to be a dichotomy between the self and the other, where the other clearly accuses the self of fleeing away, φυγή, whenever necessary, while the self tries to justify this repetition in behavior by interpreting φυγή as ascent and creative deconstruction through the destruction of everything he had been attached to at the time of speaking. The word φυγή is also used in αναφορά στον Γκρέκο, in the chapter titled Λαχτάρα φυγής, where the writer describes his longing to flee far away from the city where he was growing up as he was getting older. In the chapter titled Naxos, he refers to the first honest confessions of his desire to travel. Πλάταινε ο νους, πλάταινε μαζί του και ο κόσμος. Γέμιζε η φαντασία μου με θεόρατα δέντρα, με αλόκοτα θεριά, με μαύρους και κίτρινους ανθρώπους και μερικά λόγια που διάβαζα αναστάτωναν την καρδιά μου. Σε ένα από τα κυτρινισμένα του τα βιβλία διάβασα «Χαρά στον άνθρωπο που δει τις περισσότερες θάλασσες και τις περισσότερες στεριές». Έκανα υπομονή, ετοίμαζα μέσα μου κρυφά, χωρίς να το υποψιάζουμε, τη μέρα που θα κάνω φτερά και θα φύγω. It's quite obvious from his words that there was a longing to travel early on in his life, which might also be connected with the acceptance that he could not contribute to his country's battle in the way that was normally expected from the young Cretans of the time. Thus, at a later stage in his life, departing his country and choosing to visit as a correspondent countries that were under geopolitical and social changes, including dictatorships, civil wars, colonizations, etc., does not seem to be at all a random choice. It is my conviction that these served him in two ways: nourishing his desire to flee from the homeland, the nation, the self, as a set of imposed upon characteristics, and his search for action through the intellect, making thus a difference in the making, or rather recording, of history. Even though the fact that he could express his agony and battles only through writing caused him distress, as we've already seen, at the same time offered him a creative escape from a feeling of entrapment due to his inability for action per se. Hence, travel writing, perceived as a vital combination of action and stillness, was crucial. Action being equated with travelling, and stillness being equated with thought, as the basic presupposition for recording on paper his impressions for travelling, provided a way of balancing out that which tore him apart: action, matter, versus inaction, spirit. Besides, it's no wonder that the theory with which Kazantzakis flirted throughout his life was Henry Bergson's élan vital, which is the eternal flow of energy, the transubstantiation of matter into spirit. So, let's go to travel to Russia. The Cretan travels to the Soviet Union in 1925, a year after Lenin's death, as a correspondent of the Athenian paper Eleftheros Logos, which published his impressions in a series of articles. 2 years later, in 1927, he visits the Soviet Union again, this time as a guest of the Soviet government for the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. We need to bear in mind that 1927 was the year when Joseph Stalin managed to consolidate power, following the 1924 year of death of Lenin, through suppressing Lenin's criticism and by eliminating any opposition. Having proclaimed that the bourgeois had outlived his usefulness and that the communists were the ones bearing the flame of élan vital, Kazantzakis at the same time persisted that he was not a Marxist, for he was too much of a mystic and too dedicated a theist. Hence, his ample contact with the Soviet Union only confirmed the necessity of materialism being transformed into spirit. Otherwise, he believed that they would suffer the doom of all previous cultures. At times, Kazantzakis' thought seems to be clearly structured, but the moment the reader thinks that he or she realizes where the writer stands, the Cretan resorts to the technique of entering an unknown interlocutor, wearing the mask of a young European man, or that of a blonde Russian lady with big blue eyes, or the mask of a senior student in electrical engineering. I quote the corresponding pages. As a means for him to elaborate on existential ideas such as spirit versus matter,